Modern science and advanced technology has greatly expanded our horizons, mentally as well as far into space beyond our planetary home. But one thing has remained constant: the desire for heroes to admire and emulate. Early on, these heroes were gods and those who claimed connection with gods. Also high in people's estimation were those who displayed bravery and skill in battle on a variety of levels. Food for Thought Productions wishes to honor innovators and freethinkers around the world, Freethought Heroes who have enriched our lives immeasurably by rising above and beyond the accepted ideas of their time. We begin in the Far East. 25 centuries ago, the Chinese philosopher Confucius developed one of the great ethical systems in human history. Confucianism is not a God-worshipping religion. It's simply a rational methodology for living a good life at peace with self and with others. While the Greeks had a pantheon of gods based on human characteristics, but with extended range and powers, the real Greek contribution to civilization was from their great philosophers, Socrates and Aristotle, the playwrights whose works were early expositions of psychological truths. The best drama, comedy, literature in all forms draws inspiration to this day from these early creative geniuses. The Romans learned from the Greeks and expanded on the culture they inherited, particularly in the visual arts. Early, the church was the principal patron of the arts and used talented artists to strengthen its position and build its influence and wealth. Popes worked closely with artists to illustrate Bible stories, such as Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which shows God giving life to Adam, an imaginative explanation, accepted as fact by true believers. Art was used to depict realms beyond this planet, heaven and hell inhabited by gods, angels, devils, and other beings from human imaginations. But this period gave way to the Renaissance, rebirth, indeed, birth of a new era, an interest and awareness of the wonders of this world. Leonardo da Vinci and other artists began to draw from life and nature. Da Vinci risked punishment for studying human cadavers so that his drawings would more truly show physical attributes. The Dark Ages were aptly named because during this period the Catholic Church conducted inquisitions in Spain and other countries that reached unbelievable depths of depravity. In France, the revered Maid of Orleans was condemned to death for ignoring Paul's condemnation of sexual ambiguity in 1 Corinthians 11:14, quote, "Does not nature teach that if a man have long hair, it is a shame to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her," unquote. Joan wore men's clothing and pursued a career reserved for men, and so she was burned at the stake as a harlot and a heretic in May of 1431. The names of her tormentors are forgotten, but Joan has an afterlife in the minds of her admirers. A letter-writing campaign to the Vatican finally bore fruit in 1920, when Pope Benedict XV authorized canonization for Joan of Arc, thenceforth Saint Joan. Martin Luther, a Catholic monk, was an unlikely freethinker, but he criticized the Catholic Church hierarchy for, quote, "hopeless wickedness and corruption," unquote, and went on to challenge Catholic dogma. His protestants were followed by a host of other dissenters. Rationalism came into its own with a period known as the Enlightenment. Leaders in this movement were secular writers dubbed the encyclopedists. In France, Voltaire, D'Alembert, and Diderot, among others, developed a massive compendium of writings that challenged religious dogma. They questioned immortality of the soul, miracles, all manner of supernatural phenomena. Definitions of good, evil, and a variety of ethical questions came under their scrutiny. They sought human solutions for human problems. Baruch Spinoza, a Dutch Jew, suffered excommunication from the Jewish community when he applied reason to religious dogma. Spinoza even had the temerity to question God's power and exercise of it. But time heals, and Spinoza is now proudly claimed as a great Jewish philosopher. When patriarchal religionists enjoy unbridled power, the subjugation of women is expressed in horrific proportions. Sometime in the 3rd century, Hypatia, the beautiful and talented philosopher and mathematician at the great academy in Alexandria, was cruelly tortured and murdered at the instigation of Cyril, bishop of the city, for presuming to teach men. Sadly, unspeakable cruelty against women goes unpunished in Egypt to this day. And Egypt is not alone in these practices. Most fundamentalist countries subject women to unspeakably inhumane treatment. While progress was being made in Europe, enlightened principles found expression in America through such people as Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Statute of Religious Liberty for his home state of Virginia. Jefferson had an illustrious career, serving his country in a number of capacities, culminating in 2 terms as President of the United States. But his most precious legacy, in the opinion of non-religionists, was establishment of the first secular university in the world, the State University of Virginia. Thomas Paine immigrated to America from England and ignited revolutionary spirit in this country, and in France as well, with his writings, particularly The Age of Reason, a powerful indictment of biblical religion, which became an immediate bestseller. Perhaps no other book has shaken the beliefs of so many and set them onto the path of reason. Paine was a pioneer, and though he suffered many slings and arrows from his detractors, he persisted all his life in publishing the ideas he so fervently believed in. Meanwhile, back in England, David Hume contributed to rationality with his devastating works On Miracles and Dialogues on Religion. Unlike Paine, Hume chose to order that his more controversial works be published after his death. A pioneer fighter for women's rights, Mary Wollstonecraft inflamed a generation with her 1898 Women's Bible, which attacked Christianity for its subjugation of women throughout history. A formidable team consisting of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were active at the same time as Mary Wollstonecraft. Ms. Anthony was attracted to Mrs. Stanton when she heard about an exchange between her and a married minister at the first Women's Rights Convention. It seems this minister upbraided Mrs. Stanton for speaking in public, reminding her that the Apostle Paul adjured women not to speak in public, and asking, "Why don't you mind him?" Mrs. Stanton responded, "The Apostle Paul also recommended celibacy to clergymen. Why don't you mind him?" These 2 women formed a powerful coalition to right the wrongs the Apostle Paul had inflicted on women. Mark Twain used wit and humor to make his serious points and influenced great numbers, some so subliminally that they swallowed his ideas with only minimal resistance. Twain was highly regarded in his lifetime and deservedly prospered as he tapped into the skeptical spirit of his day. Thomas Alva Edison was a hard-working realist whose countless inventions were the result of a practical, rational mind. Languishing about waiting for divine inspiration was no part of Edison's makeup. He had no use for such nonsense and was an outspoken critic of dogmatic creeds. Sigmund Freud, who consistently proclaimed himself an atheist, pursued his investigations into the mind and revolutionized humankind's view of itself. His writings and lectures exposed millions to new ways of analysis and critical thinking about the ways we function. He attributed nothing to mystical interpretations of soul and divine inspiration. He also criticized the psychological impact of religious beliefs that foster guilt feelings and unrealistic assumptions about sexual behavior. Friedrich Nietzsche's influential book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and his proclamation of the death of God was perhaps a natural outcome of his disastrous experiences at home. His highly religious mother eventually drove him mad. But his ideas were not unique. Many others felt that Nietzsche presaged a post-Christian era in Europe, which in fact is occurring at the present time. Charles Darwin dealt a crippling blow to literalist biblical faith and creationism with his discoveries and writings about evolution. Amazingly, the debate between creationists and realists continues to this day, and the stakes are nothing less than the education and intelligence of our children. French novelist Amandine Dupin, better known as George Sand, staked out new territory for women by her open skepticism and her calculatedly outrageous behavior, which served notice that she would not be boxed into some biblical preordained role. She wore men's clothing, openly took lovers, the best known being Frédéric Chopin, and smoked cigars in public. She delighted in shocking the bourgeoisie. Decades later, another George Bernard Shaw that is, English critic and playwright, outraged the conventional with his brash writings about religion, straight-laced morals, and politics. Still another George Eliot, was actually Mary Ann Evans, an Englishwoman who found it necessary to take a masculine pseudonym in order to get her novels published. Mary Ann achieved fame and fortune for her literary talent, but was infamous for her critical stance toward religion. Although Mary Ann had to drop out of school early to take care of her invalid father, she continued her education in the well-stocked library of her home. Raised in the Church of England, Ms. Evans immersed herself in theology between the ages of 15 and 22, but when she acquired a circle of intellectual friends, she made a dramatic shift to non-belief. Her first published work was a translation of Dr. David Friedrich Strauss's The Life of Jesus Critically Examined. By the time she finished this work, she was convinced that Jesus was a good man, but not the Son of God. Spanish-American philosopher and author George Santayana was another thorn in the sides of blind faith religionists with his powerful The Life of Reason. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus passionately called for individual authenticity and personal responsibility. Humanists and other non-believers share the existentialist view that human beings are responsible for their conduct toward each other. Langston Hughes wrote stirringly about justice, demanding that individuals be judged on their personal worth and not their color. Despite the injustices that marred his life, Hughes never flagged in his expectations of the triumph of goodness in the human spirit. Philosopher-educator John Dewey challenged the notion that ethical conduct must be based on dogma or moral absolutes. His pragmatism shaped the development of 20th century American education. Joseph Fletcher was the first advocate of situation ethics, a rational approach to moral and ethical decisions. He advocated use of our critical minds as opposed to blind adherence to outdated rules set up to establish power in the hands of those who would inflict their will on others. Harvard professor, author, and psychologist B.F. Skinner championed behaviorism as the vehicle to channel human actions. He postulated that we determine our own lives and fates. Bertrand Russell proved that philosophers need not live cloistered lives confined to ideas. He was an activist who concerned himself with causes unpopular in his day, such as women's rights, abolition of nuclear arms, and sexual freedom. Though a precocious and gifted child, Marie Curie's parents showed more consternation than pleasure when their 4-year-old daughter demonstrated that she could read. Whenever she reached for a book, her parents would distract her by putting a doll in her hand. Such was the prejudice against learning for a female child. But Marie had a mind of her own and persisted in developing her talents until she made valuable contributions to the world and showed the folly of holding half the population down. In 1909, a Swiss patent office clerk named Albert Einstein electrified the scientific world with theories about the awesome amount of energy locked in the core of an atom. But it was an Austrian physicist named Lise Meitner, exiled from Nazi Germany because of her non-Aryan blood, who split the atom in her laboratory in 1938 to prove Einstein's theory and release that awesome energy. Lise Meitner saw atomic energy as a means to drive ships and submarines and power to reach beyond this planet. She was devastated when she heard of the atom bomb and the destructive application of her work. Robert Greene Ingersoll, American infidel, one of the bravest, grandest champions of human liberty the world has ever seen, said Clarence Darrow. Lecturer extraordinaire, Ingersoll lambasted the old creeds from platforms all over this country for more than 30 years. He was a wizard with audiences. The more clergy denounced him, the more popular he became. Men like Mark Twain and Walt Whitman acclaimed him, and he was challenged to debate by the Archbishop of Westminster, Henry Edward Manning, as well as William E. Gladstone. This debate made the cover of the Truth Seeker magazine, which carried a cartoon showing Ingersoll over the caption, "The Race Between America's Infidel Orator and England's Christian Statesman." Mr. Ingersoll was a devoted family man who described his wife and 2 daughters as, quote, "the only trinity I believe in." Ingersoll, known as the man who defied God, was a legend in his own time and revered since his death almost 100 years ago. Margaret Sanger's mother bore 11 children and died at age 48, exhausted by the rigors of bearing and rearing her large family. The impact of this tragedy and other experiences that Margaret Sanger had in her work as a nurse led to a life of alleviating suffering from unwanted pregnancies. Margaret chose reason rather than the biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply, no matter what. Mrs. Sanger was a wife and mother with a beautiful home. She could have had a comfortable life, but instead she chose to serve humanity, even serving time in prison for bucking the system. In her lifetime, Margaret Sanger was vilified as a heretical monster. But today, there are Planned Parenthood chapters all across the land. Her contributions to women's health and population control are now universally recognized. Prolific author Isaac Asimov opened our minds to other worlds and to the moral dilemmas perhaps inherent in creating sentient beings by our own hand. And by his example, he demonstrated that exuberance and a zest for life are compatible with a view of living unsullied by superstition. The favorite quote from Asimov says, "It is only when people feel free to think for themselves, using reason as their guide, that they are best capable of developing values that succeed in satisfying human needs and serving human interests." Andrei Sakharov fought a bitter battle against totalitarianism and in defense of humanist ideals and intellectual freedom. By his inspiring example, he was one of the first to prove that the Soviet colossus could be resisted and beaten from a stance of principled ideals. Mr. Sakharov is shown here with Paul Kurtz, a towering figure in today's Freethought community, publisher of Prometheus books, Free Inquiry, and Skeptical Inquirer magazines, and the moving force behind the Centers for Inquiry. The list goes on and on. Outstanding individuals. But there is one more outstanding individual we want you to meet. Not all of us can accomplish great deeds by ourselves, but we can realistically accomplish miracles by joining together. Here is Matt Cherry describing the organizational work he spearheads.
The world's humanist groups are joined together in an umbrella group called the International Humanist and Ethical Union, IHU for short. Formed in 1952, IHU now has 100 member organizations from 35 countries. IHU has consultative status with the United Nations and many other international bodies, including UNESCO, UNICEF, and the European Union. It therefore has teams of representatives at the United Nations in New York, in Geneva, and in Vienna, and it has representatives at UNESCO in Paris, UNICEF in New York, and the European Union in Brussels and Strasbourg. IHU is the only explicitly non-theistic organization to hold official consultative status at the United Nations and at these other major forums. And the IHU is therefore representing, at the very highest global levels, the views and concerns of the godless people of the world. At present, organized humanism is strongest in Europe, especially Northwestern Europe, India, and America. The social and organizational contexts in these three regions are quite distinct. Europe is highly secular, with organized religion and belief in God in massive decline. In France, Britain, Germany, Italy, Spain, Scandinavia, and the Benelux countries, between 25 and 55% of the population do not believe in God. I would like to talk about the work of the Atheist Center, which is in Vijayawada in the southeastern state of Andhra Pradesh, and in particular their work in trying to eradicate religious prostitution. In India, in the Hindu religion, there is a belief, a system called the Jogini system. And according to this system, girls from certain lower caste or untouchable caste families may, at a young age, be married to a local god. And when the girls reach the age of puberty, they're ritually raped by the local priest, and then they become the public sexual property of the upper caste men, and they cannot refuse sexual favors to any of the men from the upper castes. And this is a religious ceremony, this is a religious tradition, and it includes other factors. That they have to dance at funerals, they have certain roles to play. The Atheist Center in Vijayawada dedicated itself to eradicating religious prostitution in its state and in India. First of all, they got religious prostitution outlawed by the state government. This was a beginning, but it was not enough in itself, because they still had to persuade change to take place at the village level. They still had to persuade the priests to stop initiating girls into the system, and they had to find a way of helping the women and their children who are involved in this terrible system. They had to find a way for them to escape and live a life independent of that. And to this end, they have provided education for the priests and the villagers as to why this system is wrong. They have provided education for the women and for their children so that they're able to earn their own living outside of the Jogini system. And they've even got the government to support them in providing some land and some livestock so that the women can live independently on their own, and they help them to arrange marriages through a marriage bureau and to become independent of this system. In the late 1980s, in the state of Andhra Pradesh alone, there were over 10,000 women who are Jogini, who are religious prostitutes. And many of these women had a lot of children. Often a Jogini will have 4 or 5 children before the age of 25, and they will very often die in their 20s or 30s because it's a terrible life for them. Now they have less than 5,000 religious prostitutes still practicing, and the atheists are convinced that by 2005 they will have entirely eradicated this terrible system. And this is one of many programs run by the Atheist Center. And the Atheist Center is just one of many humanist groups in India. And it's an example of the wonderful work they're doing, and an example of how the humanist approach can both eradicate a terrible evil, but also give the people the means to live their own lives with dignity and the means to look after themselves.
The battle to preserve an environment where free thought and freedom of individual choice can exist is a never-ending struggle. Our final honoree is Barry Lynn, Executive Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, who works full-time to preserve our freedom to think according to our own conscience. It's instructive to hear him describe some of his trials and tribulations, none of which dampen his enthusiasm for the good fight. Here's a brief excerpt from a speech at a Unitarian church.
Not just about a month and a half ago, TV preacher Pat Robertson on the 700 Club referred to me as an intolerant jerk. And I was afraid that the vast number of Unitarians who follow on every word of Brother Robertson might have forced the cancellation of this meeting. I'm glad that didn't happen. And I'm particularly glad it didn't happen because his intolerant jerk remark came so shortly on the heels of some previous comments he had made toward the end of last year about me, calling me both off the wall and, my favorite, lower than a child molester. I wonder why it is that people get so angry at people like me, and I think it's because people like Pat Robertson know that I just conveniently symbolize what is an important point for hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of Americans, and that is that the church-state separation principle that has served us so well for over 200 years is something that we're about to fight for. We're not going to let it be taken away, not by Pat Robertson and not by anybody else. And we're beating Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and people like them in the courts. We're beating them in legislatures in Washington and around the United States. We're beating them at initiatives and ballot initiatives in California and Colorado and all over the country. And we're even beginning to beat them in the court of public opinion. So for nearly a decade, people like Pat Robertson were always on the offensive. They did things, we just responded to it. Now we're forcing them to respond to charges and respond to the criticisms of people like us. And that puts them in a very uncomfortable position, and I think makes them particularly angry. Sometimes I get accused of being too optimistic in my analysis of the religious right. I say that they're on the run and that they can in fact be beaten. You know, we didn't declare a religious war for the soul of America. That was my former partner on the radio, Pat Buchanan, back in 1992.
We hope you have found this program intellectually stimulating and that you will continue to investigate the ideas raised here. To connect with other like-minded individuals, please contact any of the dozens of free thought organizations, such as the American Humanist Association, American Atheists, the Center for Inquiry, and Atheists United. You may also email the producer directly via leebaker27@gmail.com. This program has been distributed through the courtesy of Atheists United.